Die Welt, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, die Welt scheint zunehmend aus den Fugen zu geraten. Zumindest nimmt die Zahl und Dichte der Publikationen und Ankündigungen mit dieser oder noch apokalyptischeren Formulierungen in den letzten Jahren rapide zu. Umso wichtiger erscheinen und erschienen immer schon Hilfsmittel, die den Eindruck vermitteln, die Welt wäre eben doch in den Griff zu bekommen. Die Preisträgerin des Willibald-Sauer-Preises am Zentralinstitut für Kunstgeschichte 2025, die wir heute Abend auszeichnen, hat sich genau damit beschäftigt, wie man die Welt in den Griff bekommt. Ausgezeichnet wird Magdalena Becker für ihre Dissertation zu Handhabbare Welten, Aushandlung, Standardisierung und Nützlichkeit kartografischer Visualitäten im 20. Jahrhundert. Frau Becker wurde 2024 an der Hochschule für Bildende Künste Dresden promoviert und sie ist derzeit Scholar in Residence am Forschungszentrum des Deutschen Museums München. Ich würde Sie bitten, liebe Frau Becker, nach vorne zu kommen, zunächst für den Preis und dann vielleicht um mit einigen Worten selber Ihr Thema vorzustellen. Bitte schön. Sie wissen, der Preis sind quasi Naturalien, also die Möglichkeit praktisch mit dem Preisgeld am ZI je nach Lebensstil zwischen 2 und 4 Monaten zu forschen. Bitte schön.
Ja, vielen Dank für die Vorstellung und ein herzliches Willkommen auch von meiner Seite. Ich freue mich, Ihnen nun ganz überblicksartig meine Dissertation mit dem Titel, den Herr Pfisterer gerade schon genannt hat, Handhabbare Welten, Aushandlung, Standardisierung und Nützlichkeit kartografischer Praktiken im 20. Jahrhundert vorstellen zu dürfen. Längst ist das kritische Hinterfragen von visuellen Quellen in Popkultur, Journalismus und Wissenschaft ein Teil bildwissenschaftlicher Auseinandersetzungen. Kartografische Darstellungen wurden hierbei jedoch merkwürdigerweise größtenteils umgangen. Gerade vor dem Hintergrund der Omnipräsenz von Kartenbildern in unserem Alltag ist dies mindestens erstaunlich. Nicht selten wird deren Anspruch an Wissenschaftlichkeit, Objektivität und Authentizität unkritisch übernommen. In meiner Dissertation habe ich daher wissenschaftliche Fragestellungen an die Visualität der Karte entwickelt, die zwischen Bildwissenschaften und Wissenschaftsgeschichte operieren. So argumentiere ich, dass sich die Aushandlung kartografischer Darstellungen stets in einem Spannungsfeld von Standardisierungsbestrebungen und konkreter Nützlichkeit vollzieht. Eine zentrale Erkenntnis lautet, dass es sich dabei nicht um fixierte Pole statisch definierter Konzepte handelt. So hat sich nach und nach gezeigt, dass Standardisierung und Nützlichkeit als spezifische historische Variablen voller Widersprüchlichkeiten und Intentionen zu verstehen sind. Meine Arbeit setzt sich mit 3 Materialkomplexen auseinander, anhand derer ich verschiedene Dynamiken innerhalb dieses Spannungsfeldes für kartografische Praktiken des 20. Jahrhunderts konkretisiere. Auf der Folie können Sie bereits erkennen, dass diese zeitlich das ganze Jahrhundert umfassen, räumlich von globalen Aushandlungen zu urbanen Perspektiven führen und inhaltlich von Weltdarstellungen zu regionalen Ortsbeschreibungen reichen. In einer internationalen Großanstrengung versuchten die Mitglieder der sogenannten International Map of the World seit dem ausgehenden 19. Jahrhundert die ganze Welt nach einheitlichen Richtlinien zu kartieren. Eine solche Megakarte sollte zugleich das Wissen über die Welt bündeln und bis dahin nicht existierende kartografische Standards festsetzen. In einer Zeit, in der sich die Kartografie als eigenständige Disziplin überhaupt erst etablierte und legitimieren musste, entfaltete das Projekt also seine Nützlichkeit als akademische Selbstbehauptung. Von der Disziplin intern dezidiert akademischen Diskussionen um kartografische Standards verlagerte sich der Diskurs innerhalb der IMW in die gut besuchte Ausstellung Airways to Peace als politische Inszenierung. 1943 im Museum of Modern Art in New York eröffnet, konnten sich Besuchende in eine immersive Kartenwelt begeben, in der die Vormachtstellung der USA als Friedensbringerin der Welt als kartografischer Fakt erlebbar wurde. Aspekte der Nützlichkeit wurden von den Ausstellungsmachern Monroe Wheeler und Herbert Bayer hier in erster Linie didaktisch und ideologisch verstanden. Das hier anklingende performative Potenzial von Karten wird schließlich in touristischen Stadtkarten, wie wir sie alle kennen und zumindest vor Google Maps regelmäßig benutzt haben, besonders frappant. Kartograf und Verleger Gerhard Falk überführte mit seinen gefalteten Stadtplänen, den bekannten Falk-Plänen, die Karte wiederum in die wachsende Konsumkultur der BRD und instrumentalisierte die Debatte um Nützlichkeit ganz bewusst als Marketinginstrument seiner Produkte. Das Gebot der Nützlichkeit wird in der Nachkriegszeit somit selbst zum Standard und der Kreis jener Debatte scheint sich zu schließen. Explizite und implizite Intention der KartenmacherInnen, politische, ökonomische und gesellschaftliche Aspekte, die Erwartungen und Ansprüche der NützerInnen. Mannigfaltige Bedeutungsschichten informieren die Visualität, Materialität und Rezeption von kartografischen Darstellungen. Die Frage nach der Nützlichkeit der kartografischen Objekte kann demnach all diese Aspekte greifen und zeigt sich als Analysekategorie ebenso für weitere anwendungsorientierte Bildmedien als vielversprechend. Zeitgenössische Diskurse, AkteurInnen und Artefakte können so weniger hierarchisch in den Blick genommen werden und historiografische Kapriolen von Umbruchsnarrativen und Revolutionen können in eine langfristige Geschichte der Persistenzen und Kontinuitäten umgeschrieben werden. Eine solche methodische Offenheit hin zu den Bildwissenschaften, der Kulturgeschichte und der Wissenschaftsgeschichte bereichert das kunsthistorische Methodenspektrum dabei um präzise Instrumente, die visuelle Phänomene umfassend kontextualisieren können und eben jene vermeintlichen Gewissheiten alltäglicher Bilder, die das Ausgangsinteresse meiner Forschung bildeten, zu hinterfragen. Zuletzt möchte ich die Gelegenheit nutzen, mich ganz herzlich bei den OrganisatorInnen des heutigen Abends zu bedanken, ebenso bei der Jury des Willibald-Sauerländer-Preises für die Auszeichnung meiner Arbeit. Und ganz besonderer Dank gilt natürlich meiner Betreuerin Angela Matisek sowie Dietmar Rübel. Vielen Dank.
Der Freundeskreis des Zentralinstituts für Kunstgeschichte, die Conjuncta Florescit, stiftet seit 2019 diesen Preis für herausragende Forschungen zur Kunstgeschichte als Wissensgeschichte, zur Geschichte der Disziplin und ihrer Methoden und erinnert damit gemeinsam mit dem ZI an den 2018 verstorbenen Willibald-Sauerländer. Ich danke der Conjuncta einmal mehr für die großzügige Unterstützung des ZI. Unser Festvortrag von Matthew Rampley beleuchtet nun die Versuche, die Welt in den Griff zu bekommen, aus postkolonialer Richtung. Why is it so difficult to talk about colonialism, art and colonial innocence in Central Europe? Matthew Rampley, der Deutsch so gut spricht und versteht, dass ich sozusagen mit meinem Englisch sicher nicht hinterherkomme, weshalb ich mir erlaube, ihn auch auf Deutsch vorzustellen. Matthew ist Professor für Kunstgeschichte an der Masaryk-Universität von Brno. Seine Forschungen zeichnen sich durch gleich 3 Besonderheiten aus, zumindest in meiner Wahrnehmung. Nämlich erstens, Matthew arbeitet gleichermaßen zur visuellen Kultur, zu Design und Bildkünsten wie zur Architektur. Zweitens, er kennt sich im, ich sage einmal, Großraum des ehemaligen Habsburgerreiches aus, also in Mittel- und Osteuropa. Und drittens, Matthew ist gleichermaßen an der Kunstproduktion und Rezeption wie an der kunsthistorischen Auseinandersetzung damit, an der Geschichte der Disziplin und den Methodendiskussionen interessiert. Ich verweise von seinen Büchern hier nur auf das letzte Visions of the Future, Modern Architecture, Catholicism and the State in Central Europe, 1918 to 1939, 2025. The Museum Age in Austria, Hungary, 2021, einer von 3 Autoren ist er da. Oder aber auf The Vienna School of Art, History, Empire and the Politics of Scholarship, 2013. Herausheben will ich aber auch den von ihm mit herausgegebenen Sammelband Art History and Visual Studies in Europe von 2012, denn das ist bislang, also meines Wissens bislang das erste und einzige Mal, dass Kunstgeschichte als wissenschaftliche Disziplin und in ihren institutionellen Verortungen in Europa vergleichend in den Blick genommen wurde. Eine Analyse des eigenen Standpunkts wie sie bei allem Interesse gerade an Wissens- und Wissenschaftsgeschichte noch viel zu wenig unternommen wird. Matthew ist derzeit Principal Investigator des großen nationalen tschechischen Forschungsprojektes Czechs and the Colonial World Design and Visual Culture since 1948. Und in dem Zusammenhang steht auch das Thema heute Abend. Vielen Dank, lieber Matthew, dass du dir Zeit genommen hast, zu uns zu kommen, und wir freuen uns sehr auf deinen Vortrag.
Ja, also vielen Dank für die Einladung, und ich muss ja sagen, dass hoffentlich ich Sie nicht enttäuschen werde, denn ich werde auf Englisch reden, aber ich denke, dass sogleich im Zentralinstitut wird auch Englisch gesprochen und auch auf Englisch Forschung geleitet auch. So thank you very much for the introduction. Now, I'm going to talk then about the question of colonialism and the difficulty and the kinds of debates that have emerged within the context of Central Europe, and in particular the Czech Republic, where I'm working at the moment. And I'm going to cover a number of different topics in relation to this. But first of all, I thought it's worth explaining how it is that I came to this topic in the first place. And first of all, as Ulrich very kindly mentioned, and I'm going to do some quite shameless self-promotion here, because I've just started leading a project on precisely this question of debates over decolonization and the place of Czech culture within this much larger debate, which of course many of us are familiar with. And of course, if you're interested, you can see the address of the project website there. So I do hope you'll indulge me in promoting my own research, but I think I'm allowed to, because today is actually my birthday, so I thought that I can do one thing at least. But yeah, so people are saying, what are you doing on your birthday? I'm giving a lecture. Anyway, so now to be more serious though, how do I come to this project or this topic? Well, initially I was drawn to it because as is so often the case within the history of modernism across Europe, many of the key works of modernism in the Czech context seem to be oriented around racialized images. In particular, for example, if you see on the left here, the Negro King, one of the kind of real markers of modernism of the painter Josef Čapek, who was an influential, important figure active between the First and the Second World Wars. Or if we think of Burian's book on jazz, Emil Burian, he was an important theorist and theatrical entrepreneur, really important within avant-garde theatre in Czechoslovakia between the wars, and it's indicative of prevailing attitudes that this book that he produced on jazz, decorated, designed by Karel Tiger, one of the leading figures of the Czech avant-garde, should include the kind of primitivizing imagery of African people that is will be familiar from other contexts. And then finally, the example on the right by Helena Jonova, Black Boy, which was one of her most successful and popular figures that was produced and reproduced many times over throughout the 20s and 1930s. And then to give one more example, which I personally find probably one of the most difficult to look at, and also one of the most shocking in many respects, is the surrealist artist Toyen, often celebrated as a major figure within the Czech avant-garde between the wars. In particular, she was a key figure who had recognition in Paris as well as in the Czech context, so she was often celebrated as a kind of figure with an international reputation, which is often quite an unusual phenomenon for Czech modernist artists. But yet one of her major paintings, Paradise of the Blacks, presents us with this very difficult and uncomfortable subject matter, a kind of racialized image of Black Africans, which exploits certain kinds of stereotypes about Black sexuality. On the right-hand side, there's one of a whole series of drawings that she produced when she was in Paris in 1925 that have similar racialized fascination with Black bodies, which occurred at the time when Josephine Baker was in Paris. And then just finally, although it's not on the same scale as the more famous museums such as the Trocadero or the British Museum and other museums across Europe, but the Czech Republic, or what was Czechoslovakia, also has its own museum of ethnography of non-European arts, the Náprostek Museum, which is in Prague. But in fact, this is just the best known because, in fact, across the Czech Republic, you will find museums that have substantial collections of material that are from outside of Europe, often from the global south, from colonized territories. Now, what prompted me to engage in this topic and develop the project was that although this material is known, this is not some great discovery, but what is so fascinating is the fact that there seemed to be a very great reluctance to actually talk about it in a critical way. So it's just registered, but there's a kind of denial to accept that there are other questions that need to be asked about it. For example, if we just come back to the Toyen, the Paradise of the Blacks from 1925, just recently, 2-3 years ago, I think in Prague, there was a major retrospective exhibition of the work of Toyen, and this image was included, but there was absolutely no commentary about the subject matter at all. And in fact, the National Gallery in Prague, which for a while exhibited it, is now in private ownership. It just kind of commented that this is just a celebration of Black sexuality, of pleasure. It's a kind of utopian image. So these kind of obvious racial qualities to this image just are not part of the discussion. And so the project that I'm running is very much about this question of how do we talk about this material, and also why is it that there's such a reluctance to actually engage with debates about these difficult questions, which I suppose for myself, having moved to the Czech Republic 5-6 years ago from Britain, seemed really quite surprising, given the kinds of debates that are just quite normal and everyday amongst British art historians. So that's like a kind of introduction to why it's even a topic. Now, what I want to do now is to talk about a more recent episode, which introduces some of the problems, I think, that have become really clear when the topic of colonialism, coloniality emerged. And quite by accident, actually, I have to say, this afternoon, I had a very nice hour speaking with one of the students here who, in fact, turned out had done some work on the example I'm going to talk about. So that's great as well. Now, in the summer of 2024, there was a petition was uploaded on a website for kind of online petitions, signed by all the kind of good and the great of Czech culture. And I'm sure that many of these names will probably be unfamiliar with you, and I'm not going to go and say who they were, but broadly speaking, they were representatives of the generation of artists, designers, scholars who first emerged to professional prominence in the years immediately after 1989. And in fact, for example, you can see here Milan Knížák is an important conceptual artist. He had even been quite an important figure in the 1960s as a kind of representative of the Czech underground at the time. And so, but by the 1980s, 1990s, he'd become a major figure. For a long time, he was the director of the National Gallery. So what was this online petition about? What was it? What were they demanding? Well, I'm not going to expect you to be able to learn Czech in 5 minutes, so I've mercifully given you a translation. And they say, a statement and appeal from artists and the cultural public to the Academy of Fine Arts, the Czech Academy of Sciences, and the National Gallery of Art. And in particular, they were demanding 3 things. The first was the resignation of the rector of the Academy of Fine Arts in Prague, Maria Topolčanská. And in fact, she has resigned since then. What they also called for was a return of the original format of the Jindřich Chaloupecký Award. Now, this is the most prestigious award for contemporary artists in the Czech context, and it's named after Jindřich Chaloupecký, who was a really major art critic, really most active in the years from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and who some have compared, in terms of his importance, some have compared him with, say, somebody like Clement Greenberg in the extent to which he shaped the orthodox view of of the canon of Czechoslovak art of the post-war era. And then finally, a call for the consistent restructuring of the Academy of Fine Arts and the National Gallery. And in particular, I'm interested in the National Gallery, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But one gets a sense of what they were concerned about in this statement here. I've included just on the right here, where they say, by her actions, the rector, that's Topolčanská, expresses contempt for cultural heritage and gives undue space to activist trends, thereby questioning the credibility and dignity of the entire institution. So this is an older generation who are objecting to the fact that much contemporary art of the younger generation is marked by political activism. And what they particularly objected to was a kind of activism that addressed questions of coloniality. Now, why does the director of the National Gallery come into this equation here? Well, there are 2 reasons. The first is that in December 2023, the director of the National Gallery, Alicja Knast, was one of a number of figures who were asked in a kind of questionnaire. They were asked, well, what do you hope for 2024? And she said, from my point of view, we shall have to focus on 3 areas next year. First, we shall have to find new ways of discussing and resolving the colonial past, and do it in the countries of Central Europe too. So, and I subsequently have discussed this with Alicja Knast, who said that on the basis of this statement, she even received death threats because she was suggesting that colonial heritage, coloniality, was an issue not merely for the well-known colonial powers, whether it's Germany or Britain, France, but also it has some kind of relevance for cultural life in Central Europe. There's a colonial past to deal with. And so this is the first thing. The second was that the Czech entry to the Venice Biennale, which was overseen by Knast as the director of the National Gallery, was this work by Eva Koťátková. The heart of a giraffe in captivity is 12 kilos lighter. And the work was, it was a kind of study about the fact or of the transfer of the first giraffe to Prague Zoo in 1954. It was moved there from Kenya. And it was the first time a giraffe had actually been on display in Prague Zoo. I hope I'm not going to be corrected for saying that, but I think that's right. And what Koťátková's work was about, of course, was examining the relations between zoos, colonial politics, the ways in which animals themselves were turned into kind of commodities within a much wider imperial global economy. In response to this, the signatories of the petition particularly critiqued Knast for this suggestion. The National Gallery is run by the relatively unknown Alicja Knast. I should add that she was Polish as well, which was also a sin, it seems, who was unfamiliar with the Czech cultural environment and makes no effort to collaborate with Czech artists. She drags the entire institution down to insignificance and flaunts the most ephemeral contemporary ideologies, the most absurd of which is her attempt to decolonize Czech culture. Mrs. Knast apparently does not realize that our country has always suffered from the domination, colonization of other nations, and that unlike London or Paris, not a single building has been built here from the wealth of the so-called global South. President Masaryk even refused colonies in Africa offered to him for the Czechs. In case you're wondering what that final reference is about, it's the fact that in 1919, there were one or two slightly eccentric figures who proposed that Togo, which obviously had been a German colony, that it should somehow be granted to Czechoslovakia as a kind of reward for being on the side of the Allies, and because obviously all self-respecting European countries should have some African colony. Now, what we see here then is a very powerful statement of a view which is endemic, certainly for the older generation within Czech culture, and which is not only, I would argue, and that's the view that debates over coloniality have no relevance to Czech culture because the Czechs were themselves on the receiving end of colonial rule, whether that was under the Habsburgs, under the Protectorate, or of course under the Soviet Union. And as a result then, the suggestion that both Knast had made, but also obviously Koťátková, that in some sense Czech culture was entangled with the wider network of colonial relations, exploitation, and so forth. This kind of touched a very raw nerve. Now, I should add that this was not, that there were dissenting voices. For example, not long after this petition was put online, there was a kind of parody was uploaded, which as you can see from the image just at the bottom here, there's Jacques Chirac and various other figures from the 90s saying, you know, new petition by national artist demands the return of the world to before 1996 and a ban on women in public space. And of course, that's precisely because the target of this petition was women in public places, so it was problematic in that way as well. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that this is not a view that everyone shares, but nevertheless it is a view that many figures in Czech culture really hold to, and very powerfully. And it means that the whole debate about the coloniality and colonial legacies within Czech culture are a very sensitive political issue, surprisingly perhaps, when one compares it with countries that have much deeper colonial pasts. Now, how does one explain this then? There's a very useful summary of the idea of, or the kind of attitude towards colonial past. It's been given the notion of colonial exceptionalism, which was coined by a really very interesting ethnographer based in Prague, Philip Herzer, who talks about precisely the way in which despite these very graphic examples of the kind that we see at the beginning of my talk here, these images, racialized images, that somehow there's this deep belief in a kind of colonial exceptionalism. Now, what's interesting about this is that it's not necessarily something that is unique to Czechs. And arguably, I would say that it's something that is a much deeper view, it's held much more broadly across Central Europe. In particular, for example, Austria is no exception. For example, in 1949, Hugo Hassinger, who was president of the Austrian Geographical Society, publishes this book, Österreichs Anteil an der Erforschung der Erde, in which he says, and I feel slightly strange about quoting something translated into English to an audience in Germany from a German book. Anyway, in any case, the explorer coming from Austria will be free of the suspicion of binding his scholarship to material interests and serving political power ambitions. For even in the time when Austria was still a great power, its explorers always preserved a selflessness and idealism. And this is a very common attitude that Austrians held. And I should state, or I should emphasize the fact that implicitly, but also sometimes explicitly, this was set up in contrast to Germany, in which Austrians would emphasize the fact that they were not motivated by the same kind of power politics that motivated German explorers and scholars at the same time. And I think that is quite clearly something that has also filtered through into Czech culture. What is, I think, most surprising is the extent to which, even to the present, that view has persisted. So it was 10 years ago now, but it's a very interesting book, Orientalism in Mitteleuropa. It's a very useful collection of essays edited by Robert Born and Sarah Lemon. And one of the contributors, Johannes Feichtinger, who's a really very good, really interesting scholar of Austrian or Habsburg science, writing about Austrian Orientalism, reiterates this same kind of trope that in the late Habsburg Empire, the Orient did not represent the obverse of a superior West without a voice and the object of a discursive attribution. Rather, it was a place of participative inquiry that aroused curiosity. So this is a kind of common trope, the idea that, well, unlike the French or the British, even implicitly the Germans as well, somehow the Austrians had a much more disinterested, selfless concern with the cultures of the Islamic world, and it wasn't driven by power politics in quite the same way. So therefore, Edward Said is not so immediately relevant. And this kind of trope, I find, is it repeats itself in many different places, of course, in fact, even in Germany, in terms of the debate over the Humboldt Forum and the idea that Horst Bredekamp put forward of a kind of specific German ethnography that was different from French and British. But nevertheless, this idea of a kind of colonial innocence is a very powerful one in Central Europe. And it's obviously what underlies, I think, much of the difficulty of talking about colonialism in the Czech context. And in fact, a very interesting book by Sarah Lemon, Tschechen auf Reisen, which is about this kind of phenomenon of Czechs traveling globally, it tends to also reiterate this view, even though it's a really very interesting, very well-researched book. And in order to justify this, there are many examples of Czech figures who are often celebrated as examples of precisely this kind of exceptionalism. Perhaps one of the best known is Alois Musil, and he's best known because, of course, he was a major figure in the Habsburg Empire as well, and he first came to fame in 1908 when he discovered the fortress of Qusayr Amra in Jordan, an early Islamic fortress which caused a sensation when it was first discovered because it had these figurative frescoes which completely contradicted what were then ideas about the development of Islamic art. But he's celebrated by Czechs because not only for his scientific discoveries, but also because of the fact that he became, and he develops quite close personal relationships with many Bedouin tribes in what is now Jordan or northern Saudi Arabia, as a result of which he gained this kind of nickname Sheikh Musa, as we can see here. And he's seen as often an example of the way that Czechs were different. Now, I have to express my skepticism about this because in many respects, he was just simply the mirror image of Lawrence of Arabia, because Lawrence of Arabia also developed very close relationships with Bedouins. It's just, unfortunately, that for some reason, he's more readily associated with British Empire. And in fact, Musil is even more interesting because he, although he was, he was Czech and German, and I think if you had asked him if he was, before 1918, if you'd asked him about his nationality, it was obvious that he was just a Habsburg subject. And he didn't identify himself as Czech. But during the First World War, in fact, he ended up leading the attempts by the Habsburg Empire to persuade the Bedouins to remain loyal to the Ottoman Empire. And of course, he failed. And as a result, he was sort of always embittered by this, that basically it was Lawrence of Arabia who had been successful. And interestingly, when Lawrence of Arabia, when he died in, I think, 1934, Alois Musil, he wrote this very unpleasant obituary about him, saying, well, he never knew Arabic very well, and he just bribed them. And so even into the 1930s, he was very bitter about that failure. But more importantly, obviously, what that demonstrates also is that he was also part of great power politics, but just on the other side. Another figure who's less well known, perhaps, but maybe has a greater claim to embodying this so-called colonial exceptionalism is Alberto Fritsch, who was a botanist and an ethnographer, spent many, many years in Brazil. And in fact, one of his great achievements was to highlight colonial abuses by German colonists in Brazil, which led to an investigation by the Brazilian government in, I think, 1910, something like that. So Fritsch, perhaps, one could genuinely argue, perhaps, that maybe he does bear out this argument that Czechs have, that somehow they didn't have the same kinds of colonial ambitions quite clearly as the greater powers in Europe. And the same kind of argument has been made in respect of Jerzy Hanzelka and Miroslav Zikmund, who embarked on this tour across Africa in a Tatra 807 car. And in fact, this became it's become a kind of a lieu de mémoire within Czech culture, because as they were traveling around Africa, and eventually they published their experiences as a book, but also there's films that they made as well. But they highlighted, for example, colonial abuses and apartheid in South Africa as well. But they became celebrated figures to the extent that what you can see in the top left is actually the lid of a game that was produced on the basis of their adventures. So there are some cases or figures who are often brought out as part of a kind of argument as to why the Czechs deserve special treatment. But more often, what tends to happen is within the Czech context that, generally speaking, institutions, individuals try to completely avoid the question of coloniality at all. So, for example, in the National Gallery of Prague in 2014, there was a very large-scale exhibition about Japonism in Czech art, but it very skillfully circumvented any kinds of debates about this question of cultural exchange between Europe and Japan. And the same thing can be said about a whole raft of other publications, going back to the exoticisms from 2007, for example, through to a much more recent book, Collecting Asian Art, which kind of talks, well, although the subtitle says cultural politics, but what's interesting is that it substantially avoids a meaningful engagement with cultural politics, precisely because I think it's trying to avoid controversy. And indeed, what it tends to do instead is adopt a kind of positivistic registering of the fact that there are many works of art and artifacts from non-European cultures that are in museum collections in the Czech Republic. But it doesn't go further than that. There's a kind of celebration of the fact that they are there, but a kind of very reluctance to really engage with deeper questions as to why. And the same could be said, for example, of the way that the Náprostek Museum, which has substantial collections of materials from a whole range of different places, mostly kind of through donations by travelers, it has published a whole series of catalogues and books about the activities of travelers and collectors who donated works to the collections of the museum, but without wanting to engage with the questions of what they were doing there in the first place. And then the same can be said not only of the Náprostek Museum. In the center of the slide here is the front cover of Tales of 1001 Nights. And I guess the title alone highlights this slightly cliched understanding of or approach to Islamic culture. But it's an account of the Islamic substantial collections of Islamic art in the Moravian Gallery, and about the collectors, the Moravian Galleries in Brno, I should say. But again, there's a kind of great reluctance to engage with this. But so there's a kind of difficulty, I think, within the Czech context with trying to wanting to engage or explore this question, simply driven, I think, by this sense that Czechs and, by extension, other Central Europeans are somehow not part of the same debate, or they don't belong in the same debate as the major kind of European imperial powers. Now, if that were where we stopped, then we would say, well, there's maybe some debate to be had, but maybe equally, quite clearly, the question of coloniality when it comes to Central Europe does have to be approached differently, and I fully accept that. But equally, however, there are some quite notorious examples of the extent to which Czechs were not simply kind of bystanders or just observers, perhaps benefiting from colonialism but not actively involved in acts of colonial plunder and so forth, but were actually much more engaged in the kind of European colonial project. But there are examples of figures who are much more, I presume the kind of intake of breath is due to the poster on the left, are much more engaged actively as participants in the European colonial project. One of the most problematic, who's become a source of really kind of quite difficult debate recently, is Emil Holub, who's celebrated as a kind of heroic figure, exploring southern Africa, mapping out parts of southern Africa that until then had not been mapped by Europeans. He collected large amounts of material that he brought back. He published books about his experience. One book, 7 years in southern Africa, and he gave on the bottom right there a whole series of lectures on the subject, both in Prague, but also in Vienna. And in fact, on the left here is the poster for an exhibition that he organized both in Prague and Vienna. And both times it was incredibly successful, very popular exhibition. Recently, and I have to give them credit for this, the Nápořtek Museum, which was the main beneficiary of his collections, they mounted an exhibition about Holub, which kind of suggested that the reason or the ways that some of the objects had ended up in Prague raised ethical questions. And the fact that, for example, there were some rock carvings which were of sacred images, and that he had just simply he'd vandalized various rocks in order to bring them back to Prague, without consulting with the local culture as to whether he could, without seeking their permission. This, it was suggested, at the very least, was a questionable activity. What's also interesting is that this exhibition, which was only really a very mild critique of Holub, itself caused controversy. And this is again where we can see how the question of coloniality, it strikes deep into conceptions that Czechs have of their own identity. So it's no longer a question about the historical record, but it's also a questioning of how Czechs view themselves. There's another example, less controversial than Holub, but who I think is indicative of attitudes, and it's the figure of Joe Hloucha, who was a great enthusiast for Japanese culture. In fact, he spent some time in Japan, and he had close associations with various members of the avant-garde in the 1920s. He exhibited his collection of Japanese and African art with modernist artists. His work, his exhibitions, and his donations have been documented in a quite rigorous way by the Nápořtek Museum itself. That's this book in the middle, the catalogue, Japan, My Love. And he played an important role in as a mediator of Japanese culture in Central Europe, and particularly in the Czech context. In addition to his collecting activities, he, for example, published numerous books. Here we've got 2 books of fairy tales that he published in Japanese fairy tales that he published in Czech. And we could probably have a debate about the actual design of the books themselves, and obviously the kinds of stereotypical images that relies on the design itself, or equally his memoirs of the time he spent in Japan, most of which seem to revolve around his experiences and fascination with Japanese women, including, as you can see on the right, Japanese Girls' Memoirs of 3 Hot Afternoons. Interestingly, he actually married a geisha, a Japanese geisha, while he was there. And I'm rather kind of amused by the how this has been reported even in the present. So here, Tiskali CZ is a kind of fairly common online website, which kind of records Hlocha's activity. And I love the headline they give it. So the Czech traveler who married a geisha so that he could bring Japan closer to his compatriots. So the idea that marrying a geisha was somehow a kind of patriotic duty that he undertook. Now, if you remember the petition in that was posted up that I started with, it talked about the fact that, or it claimed that Czech culture had nothing to do with the global South at all. That's not quite true. And in fact, one of the best examples is the Villa Tugendhat in Brno. Now, it's celebrated not only for Mises' masterful use of spatial organization and the extraordinary use of materials, quite clearly, and that can't be denied. And it is a really very important example of interwar modernist architecture. But certain aspects of it are celebrated, which bring it precisely back to the question of coloniality. And I'll start with just two aspects of that. First of all, the so-called onyx wall, and I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Villa Tugendhat, but this wall, it's not actually made of onyx, it's made of a mineral called aragonite, but it takes on these extraordinary qualities depending on the color of the light of day. So it is quite an extraordinary experience to see how, particularly in the sun, because it's opposite this huge windows, it takes on the color of the sun. Now, why am I talking about the aragonite wall or the onyx wall? Well, it's because the material from which it was made was taken from aragonite quarries in French Morocco of the time. In other words, the villa was a beneficiary of the kind of classic process of resource extraction that has become increasingly the topic of attention of colonial critiques. The same can be said too, of course, with the extensive use of tropical hardwoods, which certainly give it an extraordinary aesthetic quality, but which were all taken from colonial Dutch East Indies, or what is now Indonesia, of course, from the time. Now, this is not to say that that Mies was directly taking these materials, because they were mediated by various different dealers and materials markets. So it's a much more complicated process. But nevertheless, this highlights the extent how even a work which is now an important monument of modernist architecture within the Czech Republic is not entirely disentangled from these kind of colonial networks. I'll just finish with one other example in this section, which explains the kind of rather complex relationship to colonialism that one finds amongst even Czech radicals in the interwar period. These are taken from Reflektor magazine, which was a short-lived journal established by a number of socialist and communist cultural critics in the mid to late 1920s. And frequently, the articles would focus on colonial excesses, European colonial rule on, as one can see here, on Black Africa, or treating colonial subjects as this means black meat, or indeed here, what is most interesting is this attempt to look at the way in which the Roma and other inhabitants of Sub-Carpathian Ruthenia, which was the extreme east of Czechoslovakia between the wars. I mean, it's now part of Ukraine, but it was briefly, it was part of Czechoslovakia, and how they themselves were treated like colonial subjects. So it's very fierce in its criticisms of of the activities of the Prague government in having a kind of semi-colonial attitude towards the peripheries of the Republic. But what's notable, or caught my eye particularly in this article here about Black Africa, was the legend of the actual photo, which says, "Girls from the Bayer tribe relaxing, many a European beauty will envy the perfect shape of their bodies." So again, once more, one has this kind of fetishism, fascination with the bodies of Black people, which it seems even radicals are unable to free themselves from, despite their otherwise their criticisms of European colonialism. Now, I just want to finish with a discussion of a particular topic that's gained increasing attention in recent years, and that's global socialism. And in particular, there's been a growing degree of interest, not only in the Czech context, but across Central Europe, in the fact that during the Cold War, the socialist states of Eastern Europe developed cultural, diplomatic, economic relationships with the global South. And there's been a whole series of events, publications, and quite high-profile conferences about this topic. And in many respects, it follows the same kind of narrative that I think we can see within colonial exceptionalism. In other words, the idea that somehow there was a special socialist way of relating to the global South that was different from that of the Western powers. And indeed, there's been a whole series of publications on this topic as well. In particular, for example, Łukasz Stanek's study of architecture in global socialism talks about world making, the way in which architects from Hungary, Poland, Bulgaria helped the development of decolonized states in Asia and West Africa. Now, this is undoubtedly true in one sense, that there was a great deal of interest in amongst the countries of socialist Europe to try to develop alternative networks that were not based on entirely exploitative relationships with the global South, but it was also part of the kind of Cold War competition. And one sees all sorts of interesting results of that. So, for example, in coming back to the Czech context, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was a wave of interest in Chinese art and film as a result, of course, of the establishment in 1949 of the People's Republic of China. So the book on the left here, New Chinese Painting, and on the far right there is the film of New China. So there was a kind of great deal of interest in this to a degree that I think was not replicated at that time in Western Europe. And similarly, we see a kind of an exchange taking place. For example, there's a lot of attention has been given to an exhibition in 1956 of Mexican art, which was drawing on the memory of muralism and the intertwining of revolutionary politics and art from the 1920s in Mexico. And there was this extraordinary exhibition that really traveled around Eastern Central Europe, here, for example, in Poland, and then it moved to, in fact, even to Bulgaria and even to Peking or Beijing, as one can see on the right here. And also it came to Brno and to the Czechoslovakia as was Mexican art here. So there was this kind of very notable exhibition that has received a lot of attention in recently, but it's not the only one. Coming back to Brno again, for example, in 1971, there was an exhibition of 1962, I do apologize, an exhibition of Arabic painting and sculpture, which is also about establishing cultural diplomatic ties with what was then the United Arab Republic, short-lived, which was when Syria and Egypt formed a single nation. And undoubtedly, this cannot be denied, and I think that the people who've promoted the idea of global socialism as a kind of alternative to kind of what was seen as neo-colonial attitudes and relationships in the post-war era, they certainly have a point to make. But I think the story is more complicated than that. So in 1956, in Czechoslovakia, the journal World Literature was founded. And we have here, I apologize for not translating the introduction. It basically says, we hope that this magazine will encourage mutual understanding between people, so that because literature tells the truth, and that therefore we will overcome the kind of misunderstanding between cultures. And the journal, it has to be credited for the extent to which it quite actively promoted study and articles on literary forms that otherwise were just completely ignored. So, for example, here's an article from 1957 on classic Ethiopian poetry. One can imagine that probably there are very few journals within Western Europe that would have published articles of this kind on the vernacular literatures in various different African countries. It just didn't happen to the same degree. But nevertheless, this kind of question of solidarity with the Global South also needs a kind of critical eye, because my own view is that it tends also to be an example of colonial exceptionalism. For example, if we come back to China, those examples of China I showed, until 1961, there was a great deal of interest in China precisely because of the diplomatic political relationships between the People's Republic of China and, of course, the Soviet Union. But in 1961, there was a split occurred, of course, the so-called split of Beijing and Moscow, which meant that suddenly the environment changed. So that whereas in 1947, Jaroslav Prusek, who was one of the major figures of studies of or scholars of Chinese literature and culture in the Czech context, whereas he could publish a book in 1947 quite explicitly about Chinese culture, but then afterwards, the word China usually had to be replaced by reference to the Far East as a kind of, I guess, a way of trying to avoid direct discussion or mention of China itself. And not only that, but gradually this interest in China just completely died out during the course of the 70s and 80s, so that it's almost nobody, very, very tiny numbers of people even interested in China in the contemporary Czech context. Similarly, if we go back to the journal World Literature, it also included many different examples of images of architecture and art from the Global South. But what's interesting about this is that while the articles will be interested in contemporary literature, but most of the time, the images of the visual arts tended to focus on tribal arts. There were one or two exceptions to this. So, for example, we can see here the image of Louis Armstrong from the cover from 1960. This was because the struggle for civil rights, the condition of Black Americans was relentlessly exploited in the communist world as a kind of tool or a weapon against American culture. Similarly, the building in Brasilia This was celebrated. There was a great deal of interest in the fact that the president of Brazil, who had launched the project of Brasilia, in fact had Czech ancestry. So there was a kind of certain ways in which this pattern would be avoided, but nevertheless, what one tends to see is a kind of focus that would not be so different from what one would see, say, in Britain, France, the United States, which is focusing on the tribal culture and the traditional tribal culture of the countries and territories from the global south. I just want to finish by considering maybe why it is that there's such a kind of hostility to dealing with questions of coloniality. And I'll take it from a slightly different angle, which is that I've already said that there's a sense in which it goes against conceptions of Czech identity. It contradicts ideas that the Czechs, in some sense, were merely the colonized and that they never had any active role or were never complicit in the colonizing project. But equally, precisely because the communist regime, and not only, of course, in Czechoslovakia, was so active in engaging and mobilizing the rhetoric of solidarity with the South, it meant that even today there is an extraordinary cynicism and skepticism and probably hostility towards a cultural politics that talks about solidarity, decoloniality, because it's seen as a repeat of a strategy that was so central to part of the kind of cultural apparatus under socialism. In 1980, the author Josef Skvorecky, who had, by this time he'd emigrated to Canada, but he says they pushed, he's talking about the experience of socialist Czechoslovakia, they pushed Paul Robeson at us. He was the Black American spiritualist singer who was himself a communist and would regularly perform in Prague, Moscow, across Central Europe. They pushed Paul Robeson at us, and how we hated that black apostle who sang of his own free will at open-air concerts in Prague at a time when they were raising the socialist leader Milada Horáková to the gallows, and at a time when great Czech poets, some 10 years later to be rehabilitated, were pining away in jails. So in other words, the problem was that although the rhetoric of supporting figures like Robeson and also the kind of anti-colonial struggle of the global South was in the name of kind of freedom, liberation, but Skvorecky was articulating a cynicism of the way in which that was mobilized by the socialist authorities, precisely at a time when at home they were pursuing an entirely different policy. And this reference to Milada Horáková, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her name. She was, well, in fact, not a socialist politician, but she was a liberal politician who, in the years immediately after the Second World War, was quite an important figure resisting the socialists. And then when they came to power in 1948, she was arrested, put on trial. There was a kind of a show trial, and along with a number of other figures, she was executed as a kind of demonstration of the new kind of political regime. And it's precisely because of this that in the petition from, as I said before, that was complaining about Alicja Knast and the Venice Biennale, they state, the Venice Biennale is presenting the story of a giraffe brought from Kenya at a time when the communists were executing Milada Horáková and others. So in other words, in answer to the question, in many respects, as to why is it so difficult to talk about colonialism, the answer would be that on the one hand, it's because it does undermine conceptions of Czech identity. But I think the other answer is that even now, nearly 40 years after the collapse of communist rule, the kind of cultural memory, the social memory of the excesses of life under socialism can often cloud and eclipse other ways of engaging with the past. So thank you very much.